Hello. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Fourth Amendment and specifically about search under the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is a fairly specific amendment and it prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. And what is reasonable is a search or seizure that's supported by a warrant, and the warrant must be supported by probable cause. So you see how specific this language is. So when you're doing an analysis using the Fourth Amendment, and we're talking about search, your first step is deciding whether or not the Fourth Amendment is even applicable. Because the Constitution only applies to government action, you need to ensure that the search is actually being conducted by the government. For example, let's say you work for an airline, which is not the government, that's a private employer. And the airline randomly one day says, okay, you need to go in for a drug test. We need to make sure that you're not using drugs on the job. A drug test is a search. It's a very intrusive search. It's a search of your body. But the airline is not the government. So the airline does not have to comply with the Fourth Amendment's mandates. So in this instance, the search would not be protected by the Fourth Amendment. You would have to comply with it. And your options are to quit your job and go work for someone else. The reason the Constitution only applies to government action is it's not quite so easy to quit your country and move to another country. So, in any event, start your analysis by making sure that the government is actually conducting the search. The next step is to decide whether or not the search is reasonable. And while this is going to be a very detailed analysis, I do want to focus on some situations that have to do with privacy. Because what the Supreme Court has instructed us is the Fourth Amendment protects individuals' reasonable expectations of privacy. So if what is being searched is an extremely private area in which a person would have a reasonable expectation of privacy, there's going to be more protection. And if the area is less private, there's going to be less protection. And I'm going to talk about three different kinds of searches, and we'll subject them to this analysis. You can have a dog sniff an item or a person, and that could be considered a search under certain circumstances. And usually when a dog does this, they're trying to ascertain whether or not there are some sort of contraband in the item, like illegal drugs or perhaps weapons. So if a dog sniffs luggage at the airport, or even a motor vehicle that's been pulled over, the Supreme Court has told us that this is not a protected Fourth Amendment search. And the reason is it involves a minimal invasion of privacy. The dog won't tell anyone what's actually inside the luggage or the motor vehicle, but they will alert if there's something illegal in those items. So they don't really disclose your private stuff unless it's illegal. In a recent case, though, the Supreme Court held that if you, as law enforcement, want a dog to sniff the front door of a residence, a house, you will need to get a little more. You'll need to get perhaps a search warrant because your house is an extremely private place. And this brings me to another part of the analysis. How does the Supreme Court know what's private and what's not? How do they judge an individual's expectation of privacy? Well, they do so using common sense. If you had an item and it was extremely private and you didn't want anyone to see it, where would you stash it? You're most likely to stash it in your house. So anything that has to do with the residence will have an extreme protection. And in most cases, you'll need to get a search warrant, supported by probable cause, of course, before you can search anything that has to do with the home. This also includes thermal imaging of a home to see if the residents of that home are using a lot of power, perhaps to grow marijuana. Thermal imaging of a home, while it doesn't really reveal anything other than the use of energy or power, it's still, because it's done on the home, a very private place, going to require a warrant. And the last thing I want to discuss is another important Supreme Court case about placing a GPS, Global Positioning System device, on a vehicle. Do you need a warrant to do that? Because what's being searched in this instance is where the individual is going in that vehicle. And the answer is yes. The Supreme Court has said to place a GPS device on a vehicle, you do need a search warrant. You can't just slap that on any old vehicle and track that individual. Good luck with the rest of this lecture, and please never hesitate to contact me if you have any questions.